Question number 4. Order. Order. Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, did he seek advice from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade about whether using the multi-million-dollar payment for the benefit of Hamood al-Ali al-Khalaf, a Saudi Arabian businessman, to cause the Saudi Arabian officials to advance the GCC FTA, which had stalled, breached the OECD Convention on combating bribery of foreign public officials in international business transactions?
Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr. Speaker, not specifically, but officials confirmed that the transaction was lawful and within the scope of the Ministry's appropriation.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
If, as he has already acknowledged, he sought no advice on the OECD Convention on bribery and no proper legal advice on the threatened lawsuit from Al-Khalaf Group, doesn't that show he wanted to keep this payoff under the table and avoid proper scrutiny by officials and by Cabinet?
Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr. Speaker, a requirement of the convention that the member refers to is to have a domestic law that gives effect to the convention in New Zealand. I'm satisfied that the Ministry would have been aware of this in assuring me that the transaction was lawful.
Supplementary question.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order. Order. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
I seek leave to table the OECD Convention, which covers pecuniary advantage to a third party in order to get a public official to act.
It's possibly freely available, but on the basis the House can determine. I'll put the leave to table this particular copy of this convention. Is there any objection to it being tabled? There is not. It can be tabled. Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Why is there no record of this first multi-million-dollar deal with the Saudi businessman ever being announced, when all other ventures are always proudly announced by him or his national government colleagues?
Honourable Murray McCully.
Speaker, there have been various references to the establishment of the Saudi hub over the last couple of years.
Order. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
I seek leave to table a 26-page list in typewritten script of all of Mr McCully's releases since 2012, none of which relate to this.
No, those releases are available to all members. Is there a supplementary question?
I wasn't seeking to release the releases. I was seeking to release the list of all the releases, none of which include these matters, sir.
No, that's the point of tabling a document, I've explained on many times, is to further inform the House. What I think the members are attempting to do there is to make a political point. That's not the purpose of tabling it. I'm not putting the leave. Does the member wish to ask a further supplementary? Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Can he assure the House that neither the Saudi officials with links to the Al-Khalaf Group nor anyone in the Al-Khalaf Group had any involvement in the tender process for the second deal, the $6 million model farm deal?
Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr. Speaker, the arrangements with regard to the $6 million in the establishment of the hub were undertaken by New Zealand Trade and Enterprise in full, according to their normal practices.
I'm going to invite the member to repeat that question because it has not been addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can he assure the House that neither the Saudi officials with links to the Al-Khalaf Group nor anyone in the Al-Khalaf Group had any involvement in the tender process for the second deal, the $6 million model farm deal?
Speaker,
Honourable Murray McCully.
I just want to be clear that I have no ministerial responsibility for trade and enterprise and therefore cannot give the precise answer that he requests, but I can say that is correct, and I can say to the best of my understanding that is the case.
Supplementary question, Honourable David Parker.
Has he received any reports that his unethical behaviour...
Order. Order. That's going to end up with the question being ruled out of order. I invite the member to ask the question without that.
Has he received any report that this behaviour has set such a low standard that other organisations operating in the Middle East using government funded have also been tainted?
Honourable Murray McCulley.
Speaker, I have received a number of reports suggesting that it is a matter of great regret to the New Zealand business community that it had in place before 2008 a government that was prepared to mislead investors in this country and require this government to try and find a resolution.
Order. Is this a supplementary question from Fletcher Tripple?
It is, sir.
Then you need to call so.
I did.
Supplementary question, Fletcher Tripple.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister clarify for the House, it was never actually this national government that entered into a contractual agreement to supply Mr Khalaf live sheep for him to export back to Saudi Arabia before it was done in the form of compensation? Honourable
Murray McCulley, if you want the question repeated, I can get it repeated. Yeah, could the member, because it was quite a complex question, could the question please, and could I have some silence on my right-hand side? Fletcher Tripple.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted clarification and to establish that it was never actually the government that entered into a contractual agreement to supply Mr Khalaf live sheep for him to export back to Saudi Arabia before it actually became a compensation exercise.
Honourable Murray McCulley.
Mr Speaker, I hope I'm addressing the question the member was trying to ask. If he's asking me, was the original business that Mr Khalaf was involved in business with the New Zealand government, the answer to that is no. The issues that have arisen with Mr Khalaf relate to events more recently as a result of the change to government policy.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
In light of his answer to my last supplementary to him, is he aware that every Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Trade, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Agriculture in the Clark government going back to 2005, that's Messrs Clark, Cullen, Peters, Gough and Anderton, have all confirmed they never once had an approach from MFAT in respect of the allegations he said were behind his facilitation payment?
Honourable Murray McCulley, if he has the knowledge to answer that.
Mr Speaker, what I am prepared to say is that the statements made in the Cabinet paper I released about the concerns that Mr Khalaf raised about being misled were verified by me by looking back over the history of this matter, but some of the references were redacted from the paper because I wanted to remove material that would be prejudicial to New Zealand's interests, so I won't take that matter any further than that.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Has he heard of any complaints about how the New Zealand Middle East Business Council, which is part funded by the government, has been operating, and if so, what are those complaints he has heard of?
Honourable Murray McCulley.
Speaker, no, I have not.
Supplementary question, Fletcher Tripple.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the answer to my earlier sup, is this then an indication or precursor of the investor states dispute settlement clauses within the TPPA, for example? We have not even signed a free trade agreement with the Middle East, and yet the government is being sued by foreign business because this government exercised its sovereign right to implement our own laws.
Honourable Murray McCulley.
Speaker, that question might more properly be addressed to my colleague, the Minister of Trade, and should the member ask it, I'm sure he'll get a lengthy and very interesting answer.
Order. Supplementary question.
It's point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order. James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek leave to table my letter today to the Auditor-General for her to investigate procedural improprieties with the contracts and payments.
Again, that's not going to inform the members of the House. That's simply an attempt to make a political point. Question. Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
I waited until the end, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in one of his answers earlier, the Minister, Murray McCulley, indicated he had no ministerial responsibility for New Zealand trade and enterprise. The previous position of the House and the previous rules of the House have been that where a minister delegates one of their functions to an associate minister, the primary minister still remains answerable and accountable to the House for that delegation.
Order. I'll hear from the Honourable Stephen Joyce.
My understanding is that NZTE is overseen by the Minister of Trade and the Minister of Economic Development, not the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
And that's certainly my understanding. I'll hear from the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Speaker, their page, their web page, which of course I'm not seeking to table, does indicate that the Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs is one of 3 ministers responsible, Mr Gross and Mr Joyce and Mr Macleay, who is down as Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Order. I don't need further assistance, but I do appreciate the points that have been raised. At the end of the day, the matter that's important here is for the Minister to be responsible for his answers. He's made an answer to this House. If he regrets that, he's got an ability to change it. If other members think that it's been an answer deliberately misleading the House, they also have a process. Question number 5, Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for